Veronica's Papers, Prologue by COLIN WRIGHT. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That is what we are told, and I have no difficulty believing it, for I have been trying to create with words all my life. But now there is loss of memory and an inability to write. Creation of the type that I desire has led to an all-embracing silence. Veronica died 3 months ago. I learned of it through an announcement in the Times. And there too was my name, Gerald Clayton, with a request to get in touch with a solicitor in London. I must confess that after my grief at her death, my first thought was that I might now learn something about the missing period in my life for which Veronica must have had the key. Why, though, had I not contacted her before, since I had her address? My hesitancy about doing so is as much a mystery as what happened to me. Did I leave her, or she me? Until about 3 years ago, everything was normal. I was separated from my wife Elizabeth, but often saw Peter and Anne, my children. I had met Veronica and was sleeping with her regularly. Then there's a blank, until about 10 months ago, when I found myself in this retirement home, comfortable, physically well, but not knowing there was a period of which I had no recall. Everything before and after is clear, but the 2-year period, roughly between 1980 and 1982, remains a mystery. The thought even occurred to me that Veronica, a psychotherapist and clinical hypnotist, might have hypnotized me, but why? And I'm well aware of the limits of hypnosis. She explained them many times. It's a well-known fact no one can be hypnotized against one's will. The fact remains that I have normal recall of every time in my life, backed up by whatever details I noted in my diary, except for those 2 years. It's understandable that I should now be in a retirement home, which I would have chosen for my declining years anyway, and I have no particular intention of leaving. Here I am, independent, and live normally except for the absence of family. I can eat in the canteen or elsewhere as I choose. The mystery is, who is paying for it all? I wrote to the solicitor mentioned in the newspaper, and last week the papers arrived, left to me by Veronica's will. One glance was sufficient to see that they related to 1 week within that missing period and to an impossible scheme devised between us. I say devised, for it had been nothing more than a fantasy of mine to bring together various people from my past and seeing them interact without their recognizing me. I'd talked to Veronica about it, for indeed it relates to my basic philosophy of life, each one of us being an aspect of God, the Creator, living out His creation in human form. My fantasy was to try to imitate that by somehow creating the circumstances of other people's lives too, but, as I say, a fantasy. At first I thought the papers were just notes which Veronica had edited and put in order, numbering the sections. When I looked more closely, there were things clearly written by her, mostly in the third person, but occasionally in the first, reading like fiction, for she was always a good writer, and indeed she sometimes appears as an omniscient narrator. There were extracts from my notebooks, which I don't now seem to have, some that I recognized, while I had no recollection of others, which, since everything had been typed, could have been invented. There were things seemingly written by the first love of my life, Janet, but until I have read through all the material, I cannot say if it is truth or fantasy. Take the first conversation Veronica records. It seems familiar. I might have said something like that, but I think not all of it. And when did the conversation take place? I have no idea. No, it must be fantasy. If only it were possible, Gerald said, as an experiment to create a situation where all those people who played a role in my life could be brought together, as kind of a game. But it obviously isn't possible. One can only fantasize about it. It might be possible in a small way, Veronica countered, not to bring together everyone, but just a few of the important ones. Like inviting a few friends to a party. No, that's not what I mean. Well, you know generally what I believe about life. Everyone on earth is linked to everyone else in some way or another. It would be interesting to bring together those who are linked to me, but without their knowing of the connection, so that they could discover it for themselves. But even if I could get them together, I could never be there to observe them. That would give the game away. There'd be no fun in that. You don't think the idea is slightly egotistic? Obviously, but in everything in life, we can only start with ourselves. I could never perform such an experiment on behalf of someone else. I don't know enough about their lives, not even yours. But I've always had this idea about God. whatever we mean by that, living out his creation within our individual lives. Would such an experiment make it possible to observe the working of God in each one of us because of the links that are there all the time, but of which we're unaware? I don't see why it should. Nor do I, logically. It's just a feeling I have, to create a kind of microcosm, however imperfect, of the normal workings of life itself. But it's only a dream, no more than idle speculation. I always enjoy speculation, Veronica said. Your idea could almost work if you solved the problem of bringing the people together. Then I could perhaps solve the problem of your being there without being recognized. By disguising me? I was somewhat sarcastic. Or would you persuade your clinic to lend me a couple of two-way mirrors so that I could watch them all? Even better, I could hypnotize them. Not to recognize me? Surely that wouldn't work. Theoretically, it should, at least with the 15 to 20% who are capable of going into deep hypnosis. You'd just have to choose 5 times as many people as you want. Well, you should know, 15 to 20%, eh? The difficulty would be in screening them to determine which ones it would work on. I'd have to travel all over the place. The first difficulty, I countered, would be to determine which of the thousands of people who've played a role in my life should be brought together at all. If you had enough money, Gerald, you could do anything, even that, with a few paid investigators. Perhaps it would be a really fun game, creating something of life itself. I gave a sigh. But it's just a daydream, an interesting fantasy. To see whether they'd find out that I was the link between them, I bet you a bottle of wine they wouldn't. I bet you they would, she concluded, if we made it clear that the object of the game was to find the link. Well, that was my fantasy, sure enough. But as I read on, the events themselves became stranger and stranger. The next section described Veronica and a meeting, of which I have no knowledge, with my first real love, Janet. And so it continued.